It feels like mystery, but it's all a part of God's great history.
No great Christ.
This was my best decision.
This is my life.
My love goes deeper with age. We've got a book of history. Now we can turn the
Great
page.
Christ. This was my best decision. My life. My love goes deeper with age. We've got a book of history. Now we can turn.
Welcome, all of you, to the Disciples History Podcast. I am Dr. Rick Lowry, president of the Disciples of Christ Historical Society, and today I am thrilled to have our friend Dr. Edward Robinson join us today for our podcast. Dr. Robinson is minister of North Tenaha Church of Christ in Tyler, Texas. He is associate professor at Texas College in Tyler, Texas, which is a historically black college associated with the CME Church, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, a school that is not far from our own disciples-affiliated HBCU, Jarvis College, there in Texas. Dr. Robinson is also adjunct professor at Harding School of Theology, a school that trains people at the graduate level for ministry and for further work in the academy. I am thrilled to say that he also effective January 1st, will be a member of the Board of Trustees of the Disciples of Christ Historical Society. So we are so thrilled to have Ed joining our family soon and to have him present, willing to participate in this podcast. Ed, welcome. Welcome. We are so happy to have you here.
Thank you, Dr. Lowry. I'm very pleased to be with you. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to begin by talking with you a bit about your teaching ministry, both in the congregation and the academy. I know that I myself, when I was going through the ordination process with the Northeast region of the Disciples of Christ, I was very clear in my mind, and they were very clear in their minds, that I was being called to a teaching ministry. And in that, you and I are brothers and kindred spirits, because I know that that this is also your self-understanding of your own vocation as minister and scholar. So I'd like for you to just talk a bit about that, about how you came to this self-understanding and this sense of your calling in life.
So thank you so much. Well, I would have to say that I'm a native of East Texas. Currently live in Tyler, but I was born and reared in Jacksonville, Texas, which is about 15 to 20 miles away. And so growing up in the context of the Stone Campbell movement in Churches of Christ, we were encouraged to involve ourselves in various aspects of congregational life from the standpoint of like reading scripture and worship, sometimes leading songs, as well as giving speeches. And so from that, I just received some affirmation, if you will, from some of the older members in my home congregation. And then there was also, in conjunction with the external affirmation, there was also an internal desire that developed that I wanted to be a spokesman for God, but not just a spokesman in that being a preacher, but I also wanted to understand um, our history. How did we get to be where we are today? And so, to that end, after graduating from Jacksonville High School in 1985, I enrolled in Southwestern Christian College, which is a HBCU affiliated with Churches of Christ. And it was there that I majored in Bible and minored in religious education. And so my desire for biblical knowledge, but also historical knowledge, just increased. And I had this thirst for knowledge. And then beyond Southwestern Christian College, I was led to Memphis, Tennessee, where Harding's Graduate School of Religion is, and earned a couple of masters there. And so I'm very thankful for the training I've received there, because it also kind of propelled me into deeper ministry, but also into the teaching ministry as well. So that's kind of how I got into what I do now. Yes, sir.
Wonderful, wonderful. Could you explain just a little bit about how the Churches of Christ tradition and the Disciples of Christ tradition within the broader, what we call the Stone Campbell movement, which we adopted that's kind of the commonly agreed name for churches in our tradition, that come out of the tradition that emerged in early 19th century America through a movement. We trace our roots to Barton W. Stone down in Kentucky and Alexander Campbell in what then was Western Virginia, now is West Virginia, now is Bethany, West Virginia, where I am located. But can you explain for the folks who will be hearing this podcast, what's the difference between the Church of Christ tradition that you come out of, sometimes called the a cappella tradition, and the Disciples of Christ tradition as you understand it?
Yes, that's a very good question. And basically, first of all, we have to acknowledge that there is so much interconnectedness.
Yeah.
There's so much that overlaps between
Yes.
Christ and Disciples of Christ
Yes.
Christian Church. And so that's the first point that must be made.
Absolutely.
And having said that, so perhaps some notable differences. The one that really stands out is, of course, the a cappella tradition of worshiping without the accompaniment of instruments of music, and that's the direction that most African Americans in Churches of Christ have gone in that direction. And then perhaps also when it comes to being a little bit more, let's say, rigid in their stance about there being, one church, and almost an exclusivism that some among us to hold. Having said that, one of the things that really I find fascinating about the overlapping between Disciples of Christ and Churches of Christ is definitely the plan of salvation in terms of the Walter Scott adaptation of hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. That's the way most Churches of Christ will present it today, even though Walter Scott's original presentation was very different. And having said that, one thing that's quite important, for example, the congregation that I serve as pulpit minister here in Tyler, the North Town Hall Church of Christ, was established by Marshall Keeble in 1935.
Oh.
Well, that's important. And it's also important to note that Marshall Keeble was baptized by Preston Taylor. And and so you're talking about something that's very ironic. And then you have the issue of rebaptism. If you are in the disciples of Christ, do you have to be rebaptized? Well, Marshall Keeble was not rebaptized because he believed that he was baptized by Preston Taylor under the plan of salvation, and that was sufficient. And you have this debate that rages in African American churches of Christ in the 1940s, and the leaders are constantly replying to the question with the answer that the disciples of Christ taught the same plan of salvation that we now do. And so I think that's quite fascinating. Quite fascinating.
So really the issue was whether you had been properly baptized because you understood baptism correctly, when you or the person baptizing you baptized you.
Absolutely.
And so after Churches of Christ and Disciples of Christ kind of split off, there was a debate in particularly African American Churches of Christ about whether people who had been baptized in disciples, by disciples, were legitimately baptized or not.
Right, absolutely.
And Preston Taylor, who I really want to get to, because this is going to be the center of what I want us to talk about today. Preston Taylor was a really, I mean, in a lot of ways, one of the most important African American disciples of Christ leaders in our history. And Marshall Keeble is probably the most well-known, important, significant Black Church of Christ preacher of the 20th century. I don't know if I'm exaggerating in that or not, but Marshall Keeble was like a giant in the Churches of Christ, and not just among African American. I mean, in the white Church of Christ community as well. Just a very well-known African American preacher, and he was actually baptized by Preston Taylor.
Absolutely. That's
and folks are trying to get him caught up in this controversy of, are you legitimately baptized or not? And he said, well, yeah, of course I am. What was the origin of the split between disciples and Church of Christ?
So that's a very good question. I believe that there was a number of factors. I think primarily you have theological issue or theological understanding, if you will. So many ways the story and conflict between African American Churches of Christ, African American disciples of Christ, is mirrored or reflected, if you will, in what we see happening among our white brothers and sisters. And that, for example, the use of the missionary society. There were those on one hand who said that it's okay, to speak where the Bible speaks. That gives us the sanction to use missionary societies, while there were others on the opposite end who said, well, no, that it's a prohibition, and we see this kind of trickling down to African Americans as well. And so a key person who will help to steer African American Churches of Christ in a different direction is going to be David Lipscomb. David Lipscomb is in Nashville, Tennessee.
Yep.
He is the editor of the Gospel Advocate. He, along with Tolbert Fanning, established the Gospel Advocate 1855, and then of course because of the Civil War in 1861, it ceases publication, and then it resumes publication in 1866. And David Lipscomb, from that time, from 1866 to 1917, he's going to wield significant influence on churches of Christ and lead them in a particular direction. Now, here's a key point. There was a gentleman by the name of S.W. Womack, African American disciple of Christ, who becomes good friends with David Lipscomb. And he is going to help to mold and shape the thinking of S.W. Womack. S.W. Womack is quite significant because he becomes the father-in-law of Marshall Keeble. When Marshall Keeble, all right, and when he commits his life to full-time evangelism in 1914, from 1914 until his death in 1968, so you can do the math there, that's some 5 decades or more. And so from that time period, Marshall Keeble, he's traveling from coast to coast, establishing churches, and here was his policy and procedure. Every time he established an African American Church of Christ, he signed that local Black congregation up with the Gospel Advocate and put them on their subscription list.
Yeah.
So the theological understanding of African Americans were not just African American Churches of Christ, were not just shaped by Scripture, but by the Gospel Advocate's interpretation of Scripture.
Yes.
So on the one hand, there are some benefits in that, but on the other hand, there are also some liabilities.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I didn't mean to go off on all that, but I'm hoping that address your question somewhat. Okay.
Yes, and that is so interesting. I mean, it has been said by a number of scholars of the Stone Campbell movement that in the Stone Campbell tradition, we don't have bishops, we have editors. And it's exactly getting at the point that you just have raised. I mean, David Lipscomb there in Nashville, Tennessee. Of course, now there's a university that actually he started. It was David Lipscomb College before it became a university. Really significant, very important university in the Church of Christ tradition there in Nashville. But Lipscomb was he was a pacifist, which actually made him initially resist the Civil War and the Union cause in the war, all of that kind of stuff, because he just didn't believe Christians should be engaged in warfare of any kind. In military service of any kind, and he also had a negative view of Christians participating in government.
That's right, absolutely.
So really interesting figure on his own, David Lipscomb, there in Nashville. So and again, a towering influence on the Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ movement. And ultimately kind of the division between the theological divisions that were beginning to emerge in the wake of the Civil War. They got focused around the issue of whether or not to have an organ in the church and generally speaking, I mean, this is not universal by any means, but generally speaking, in the southern states and in the more rural areas, folks kind of tended toward the not having instrumental music kind of tradition. They were more influenced by Gospel Advocate. And folks in the Midwest and generally the county seats and the more prosperous churches tended to say, no, we want the stained glass windows, we want the organs and the pianos and all that kind of stuff. And so we just kind of kept creeping further and further apart. And there were theological debates that were raging about all of this in the 80s, really, and the 90s. And finally, it was the 1906 census, U.S. Census, that formally identified what in fact had occurred before, which was all over the country, churches were splitting, congregations were splitting. And the presenting issue, although it was a much more complicated set of issues that were actually involved, but the presenting issue was instrumental music and whether you were going to have a piano or an organ in the worship. And it just kind of depended from town to town which church would inherit the building, which group would inherit the building and which group would move out to another place and buy their own building and start their own congregation. But that sorting out was just happening all through the late 1800s. To kind of now bring this full circle, now that we talk about David Lipscomb in Nashville, there's another very important figure in Nashville in the Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ movement. And again, I just can't stress enough that in this second half of the 19th century, there just was a very close intermixing. And so in any particular, Bethany Memorial Church, which my wife pastors here in Bethany, West Virginia, it's Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. It carried the name Bethany Church of Christ. So in any community, you see the term Church of Christ or you hear the term Disciples of Christ, you didn't really know for sure whether these were folks who had the instrument or folks who sang a cappella, that is without an instrument. So anyhow, but Preston Taylor appears in Nashville. He's a contemporary of David Lipscomb. And why don't you just talk to us about Preston Taylor? By the way, Dr. Robinson is going to give our lecture at our conference, which I want to be sure and give you all the details about, in Tulsa in March of 2022. He's going to give the scholarly paper on Preston Taylor, and he has agreed to write a biography of Preston Taylor. Yay, which we're getting in the pipeline and will be coming down the pike eventually here in the next couple or three or however long it takes to do justice to such a towering figure. But I'm going to shut up and now turn it over to you, Ed, to talk about this incredible entrepreneur, educator, preacher, civic leader, Preston Taylor.
Indeed. Preston Taylor is without question one of the most important leaders in the Stone Campbell movement, especially during the Reconstruction era. Reconstruction meaning, of course, after the Civil War, let's say 1863 to 1877, and then post-Reconstruction, he's noteworthy in that particular era, and then of course coming on up to the progressive era, if you will, let's say 1890 to 1920.
Yep.
Preston Taylor was born, as best we know, in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1849. And so this is going to be, to me, a very important, exciting work to pursue, because in the 1840s, there's a lot of interesting things that are happening in our country. We have, for example, the so-called, if you will, the Jacksonian era,
Yeah.
1825 to 1845. It ends in 1845. 1845 is noteworthy because that's the year that Frederick Douglass published his first autobiography. Okay, he escaped from slavery in 1837, and then he had his freedom purchased by supporters, and then he joined the abolitionist cause. And so in 1845, and that same year, we have the phrase "manifest destiny" that's coined. And then, of course, 1846, 1848, we have the Mexican-American War. There's a lot of important events that are happening here: the annexation of Texas, annexation of Florida. But it's in this context that Preston Taylor is born in Shreveport, Louisiana. He is an enslaved African. And, you know, by looking at his complexion, you can just about tell that he is from a biracial background.
Right.
So, and that becomes quite significant as well. And that will be something that will need to be explored in greater detail. And then, of course, he's going to make his way, his family going to make their way to Kentucky. He becomes a drummer boy in the Civil War. And after the Civil War, he lands, let's say, I believe in Kentucky, and then eventually in Tennessee, where he left an indelible mark there.
Yes.
And as an educator, let's say, for example, when after emancipation, Taylor found employment as a stone cutter, a porter, a baggage master on the Louisville and Chattanooga Railroad, before accepting a pastorate at the Christian Church in Mount Sterling, Kentucky, where he's going to serve for a number of years before relocating in 1885 to Nashville. And that's where he's going to establish the Taylor Funeral Company, and he operates Greenwood Park, which is still accessible today.
Yep.
And he's a church leader, as you said there, Rick, and he's also a community leader. And so he is one who openly opposed racial discrimination.
Yep.
And so he was an advocate of social justice on the one hand,
Yep.
while on the other hand, he was committed to the spiritual uplift of fellow African Americans. And so this gentleman is actually very, very important. And then you can maybe say that he's like a bridge, if you will, a very neat bridge from enslavement. You know, we have the issue of slavery, which we're still, as a country grappling with.
Yep.
Historians call it America's original sin. Well, he's kind of a bridge from that period all the way up until, if you will, the onset of the Great Depression, the 1930s. He dies in 1931. So Preston Taylor, and I'm in the early stages of this. I was looking at some of my files, and you are familiar, of course, with the encyclopedia, right, of the Stone Temple Movement, which came out in 2004.
Yep.
And edited by Doug Foster, Newell Williams, and others. Well, I actually wrote, I forgot about this. I actually wrote the article for that publication on Preston Taylor. And so I got a working sketch.
An outline, yes.
Yeah, an outline. But of course, it's going to take a whole lot of work to kind of put the meat on the bones, as they say. But I'm excited about this because, again, all of these subjects, the issue of slavery. You're talking about, his religious conversion, his participation in the Civil War, then the Reconstruction era, as African Americans are grappling to find their way in the world, grappling with the meaning of freedom. What did it mean to be free as a formerly enslaved person? And then for him to carve carve a niche, if you will, in the Nashville community and leave such an indelible mark that the schools that he launched, and even if they failed, we do know that he helped to launch, or he contributed to the establishment of what is now Tennessee State University. He had a
Yes.
hand in that. And so this guy, I'm very, very excited about it. For those who may listen to this podcast, I just solicit your prayers for strength and wisdom, that I can do a good job of retelling this great man's story, because he is truly worthy of a quality biography. Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Yes. I think that folks don't really understand the the kind of revolutionary act of funeral preparation
Mm,
in Middle Tennessee at that time.
mm,
There were no kind of funeral homes and burial sites that would take African American bodies. And so Preston Taylor, understanding that Black bodies deserve dignity,
mm,
they deserve to be treated with respect. They deserve to have a place where they can be buried. And this Greenwood Park, there's a cemetery that he created there. I happen to know because Sharon and I once rode our bikes as part of a fundraiser all the way up to the top of that hill to raise money for our reconciliation ministry, which deals with issues of racism. Along with our reconciliation minister, April Johnson. It was the longest, hardest ride I think I've had up that hill. And of course at the bottom of the hill, there's the Confederate cemetery, down there, and then at the top of the hill, kind of overlooking Nashville, there's this place that provides a respectful, final resting place for body. And of course, now it's open to everybody now. But at that time in Tennessee, that was the only place in Middle Tennessee, where Black bodies could get a dignified treatment and burial.
mm.
And that's because of Preston Taylor.
Yes.
He and he also created this, as you said, it was Greenwood Park. It was an amusement park
Mhm,
up
mhm.
there on this property that he bought, because African American children could not go to amusement parks that white children could go to. And so this was a place, literally from cradle to grave, where African Americans in Middle Tennessee could have the respect and dignity that they were due, because they're human beings. We're human beings created in the image of God, and and so yeah, just the and of course, as you said, the college, or the school, which became a college
Mhm,
that Preston Taylor set up there in Nashville, became eventually Tennessee State University, which is the second or maybe the first largest university system in the state of Tennessee now.
Wow. Wow.
And in the era of civil rights, in the 40s and 50s, it, along with Fisk University, another HBCU in Nashville, were sending folks up north, to Detroit to organize, to Chicago to organize. So in a lot of ways, this became the center of the civil rights movement in the middle part of the century.
Wow.
So,
Wow. Wow.
so the legacy of this unbelievable entrepreneur, and publisher and educator, Preston Taylor, the legacy continues, and it's worldwide. And it's way beyond this, the African American community. I mean, it is serving the world, literally. And we are so excited, Ed, that you're going to be presenting this story for us at our conference, and that you're going to be writing this biography for us. And we're just so happy. This will be a book that will come out, and like I say, in the next 2 or 3 years. But the conference that we're talking about is a conference, the Kirkpatrick Conference in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at Phillips Theological Seminary, March 18th and 19th, where we've got scholars of Stone Campbell history from throughout the U.S. and Canada will be coming together for this academic conference on systemic racism, anti-racism, and reconciliation in our shared history and tradition. Dr. Robinson will be presenting a paper on Preston Taylor for us there, and I wanted to ask you, as you've kind of thought about the legacy of Preston Taylor and thought about, what your participation in this conference, why do you think this is an important topic for us in the Stone Campbell movement to be talking about at this particular historical moment? What would you tell us about this? Why do we need to be thinking about this and talking about it?
Absolutely. I would say that we ought to be talking about this subject matter of racism, through the life and lens of Preston Taylor and others. We ought to be thinking about this because I believe that the Lord is calling the church to be a light in the world. And I believe that if anyone has the solution, or we can at least offer a solution to some of the social and racial ills that are still plaguing us, I believe that Christians have that. What I mean by that is, Galatians 3, that there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, bond or free, we're all one in Christ Jesus. And that's something that definitely Christians ought to be not only just talking about, but trying to practice that. And so a conference like this can help move us in that direction as we grapple with some of the difficult issues in our past, because we're now in an environment, a political, social environment, where some are saying, let's not talk about the issues of the past, and therefore let's kind of eradicate and eliminate some of the negative components of our history. And that, to me, would say that as a historian, I'm you're basically telling me that I have to present half truths, and I'm saying that no, we should want to present the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth as best we understand it. And so by learning about the story of Preston Taylor, we learn, to me, it's inspiring. It's not only informative, but it's inspiring from the standpoint that here's a man born into chattel enslavement.
Yeah.
And even though his circumstances were quite bleak, by God's grace, he was able to emerge from that and be a blessing to his community, and not just to his community, but beyond his community. And to me, that ought to be inspiring. And then there were white believers who supported his cause. All of them may not have, but there were those who did. And so, I mean, if we cannot tell these stories, then I believe that we are robbing our children and grandchildren, future generations of stories that can not only inform them but also inspire them as well. I don't know if that answers the question, but I did my best there.
Oh my Lord. Oh, my dear brother. There's nothing that I can say beyond that. I mean, that is just a perfect way for us to begin to wrap things up. That was just beautiful. Thank you so much. Before we end this thing, is there anything else that you want to say? I want to give you the chance to say whatever you want to say here before we close things up.
I'm just excited about being a part of the Disciples of Christ Historical Society. I've visited it several times in the past, not since it's been relocated, but I look forward to that. And just collaborating with others. And I'm very, very excited about the opportunity to present uh, at the conference in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in March, good
Yep.
Lord willing, and then pursuing the biography on Preston Taylor. And again, I just solicit prayers and support from fellow believers and comrades. Thank you so much.
Well, we love you and appreciate you. I just look forward with great anticipation to your participation in this conference and to this biography of this wonderful inspiration to all of us, Preston Taylor. Dr. Edward Robinson, oh, God bless you. You are in our prayers, and thank you so much for taking your valuable time to talk with us today. We appreciate it, and God bless.
God bless. Take care.